Hi, everybody. Ron Schara here with another edition of Minnesota Bound Podcast, brought to you by North Dakota at legendary.com and Connecticut. If you want clean water in your home, Connecticut is the way to go. Plus, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources manages all kinds of public hunting areas, and Star Banks, the local bank, that is the way to go. Our guest today is Greg Hoch from the Department of Natural Resources in Minnesota. And Greg is, I would say, an expert on grasslands. Now, what kind of a topic is grasslands, I might ask? I mean, who thinks about that? We don't eat grass, except the cows do. We eat corn and soybeans. So why a topic on grasslands? We're going to ask Greg Hoch that because I think grasslands might be more important to us than you realize. So, Greg, again, welcome to the program.
And thank you for having me this afternoon.
So, when we say grasslands, what are we talking about?
Yeah, so generally we're talking about the tallgrass prairie when we're talking about Minnesota, which is a habitat or an ecosystem that covered roughly about a third of Minnesota. Kind of draw a line diagonally from the northwest down to the southeast. That line's going to have a lot of squiggles and curves in it, but yeah, roughly about a third of the state would have been tallgrass prairie back in the 1800s when the first kind of Euro-Americans came in here to settle this part of the country.
So when you drive around western, southern Minnesota, northwestern Minnesota, there are exceptions, but you see mostly corn and soybeans. What happened?
Yeah, so it's actually the prairies that made those soils. It's the roots and all the critters down in those roots that made these soils so fertile. They look rich and black and fertile, and again, that's the plants that put that there. And we fairly quickly figured out that was also some of the most productive farmland in the country, if not probably in the entire world. It's interesting that the roots were actually so thick and tight in there that the original plows that they tried to do it, the plows they had used in the eastern forest soils, just couldn't work. They would talk about a 6 or 8 oxen team being stopped dead by the roots. And then John Deere came along in the 1830s with his self-scouring moldboard plow. And in about 3 to 5 decades, depending on where you're talking about, basically we lost an entire ecosystem. From Indiana to Kansas to Minnesota, we destroyed an entire ecosystem. Again, because it was so productive and raised so much corn and wheat, soybeans didn't really come in until much later. But in our effort to feed ourselves and the world, we did lose this really magnificent ecosystem.
Well, but life went on for most of us, and we lost. What did you say? Something like 90% of our grasslands now?
Yeah, probably more on looking at kind of the tallgrass prairie in general. We're probably talking 99%. I grew up in Indiana, and it's a half acre there and 3/4 of an acre there. In Minnesota, we've probably lost 96 to 98% of our original prairie.
So, as I recall, the last 50 years where I've been, paying attention to things like that, about the only people who, were upset about the lack of grasslands were pheasant hunters. Because pheasants are dependent on grass, but their concerns sort of fell on deaf ears statewide. Farmers, understandably, have to make a living, and so grassland, unless you raised cattle, wasn't important to them. They needed land for their crops, and so nobody else really got concerned about it. Yet, I don't know if we realize what we all lost with this disappearing grassland. We lost the heyday of pheasants, for example, and some other songbirds that, birds that nobody thinks about. But in a nutshell, what did we all lose when these grasslands gradually went away?
Yeah, and so I did look up some numbers for you this morning. Going back to the 50s and 60s, and again, by the 50s and 60s, almost all of it had been lost. So if you look at the August roadside surveys for the pheasants that we just finished our most recent year here a couple weeks ago, in the late 50s, our pheasant index was 330 pheasants, and again, that's an index. Then if you look at kind of 2005 to 2009, the last half of the last decade, and I'll get back to why I mentioned those years in a second here, we went from about 330 to about 92 for our index. And then if you look at the last 5 years, our index has been about 45 pheasants. So, we're working with a tenth of the pheasants we had, just 50, 60 years ago. Prairie chickens, again, going back to 2008, compared to 2019, we lost about 80% of our prairie chickens. We went from a little over 2,500 prairie chickens on the Lex in our survey area to under 500 prairie chickens on our Lex surveys. Meadowlarks, Ron, I know that's a bird that you've got some interest in. Starting from the late 1960s, they've declined 92%. Bobolink, another bird that's going to be familiar to a lot of people interested in grass, they've lost 39%. And then, of course, kind of everybody's, seen something in the news about pollinators and the pollinator crisis out there in recent years. So, yeah, it's not just pheasants. We've lost quite a bit of a lot of different types of wildlife.
I was going to say, I've always put it this way. The people who are concerned about losing pheasants are pheasant hunters. The family in Burnsville who they don't hunt pheasants, they maybe have never seen a pheasant, they don't care. I guess, people with the Audubon who love birds might be concerned about the decline of meadowlarks, etc. But the general Minnesota public was pretty much ignorant, or it didn't affect them, didn't affect their lives. But a few years ago, something changed when it came to the topic of clean water, and suddenly, and you can expound on this, suddenly grassland, abundance or lack thereof, became an interesting topic that affected Minnesota families.
Yeah, and so Ron, when you and I are talking, and we're kind of talking to the circle that we run in, pheasants and ducks or deer or turkey are kind of where we kind of gravitate towards, and I mean that's an obvious story. Pheasants equal grass, but less than 1% of Minnesotans hunt pheasants. So that brings up the question then: how can we make grassland conservation of interest to those who don't hunt pheasants and may not hunt at all? And the way we can do that is and we need a better term for this, but it sounds a little wonky, but what are called ecosystem services. So there's a number of things that grasslands do. Probably the first thing they do, and it's probably the hardest to see, we can talk about some of the little more visible ones later on, is grasslands are great at what's called sequestering carbon, or pulling carbon dioxide out of the air. And what's interesting about grass is grasslands take the carbon and stick it underground. And it's pretty much, as long as that grass doesn't get plowed up, that carbon is locked up for anywhere from centuries to thousands of years. Forests do it a little bit differently. Forests store their carbon in the trees, which are obviously above ground. Not one better than the other, and it's kind of an apples and oranges to say which is better at storing carbon. But plant grasslands where there were originally grasslands, plant trees where there were originally forests. So yeah, grasslands can pull a lot of that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that we think is probably causing a lot of the climate change issues. Now, one of the things that's a little bit more visible to folks is, one of the things we think is fairly closely tied to climate change is our more erratic weather. Seems like, those 6 and 8 inch rains used to be once in a lifetime, and, now they're becoming once a summer. Grasslands are really good at both storing water and filtering water. And that's the grass themselves, as well as the soil underneath the grass, as well as the wetlands embedded in that grass.
Well, this all sounds wonderful, but sadly, so very few people know this or get concerned about it. And some of it is a little bit, remote to, like you said, you can't really see some of these things. People can see dirty water versus clean water, however. Of course, there was a big issue about buffer strips in Minnesota, which are really strips of grassland, right?
Yep. One of the things, in fact, we can go back all the way to the 1930s with some of this research that I think people are just kind of starting to polish off again is, grasslands and wetlands are great for either preventing water from getting full of sediment because there's really no erosion in a grassland or soil erosion. So keeping that soil where it is, keeping the soil from washing and running into lakes, rivers, or wetlands. And then another issue that we've really started to notice, especially across southern Minnesota, are nitrates in our surface waters and drinking waters. And some research. There have been a number of studies published over the years that show that nitrates really get eaten up by all the bacteria and everything, insects in wetlands. In fact, there was a study published just a few months ago from the University of Minnesota that showed, depending on where you restore your wetlands in the watershed, you can either remove a lot of nitrates or a few nitrates from your water. So again, that tells us then that it's not just, we don't want to just do conservation, hand waving. We want to be fairly strategic and targeted about what we do and where we do it. Nitrates obviously are very important because they've been linked to several human health issues, in fact, fairly serious human health issues. So anything we can do to have cleaner water, both for us to drink, as well as clean water in our lakes and rivers for those of us who like to fish, that's going to be a good thing.
Well, Greg, we're going to take a little break here and say thanks to some of our sponsors, and you and I will resume this conversation on grassland. I'm hoping our listeners out there will open their ears and their eyes to what seems not obvious, and that is the value of grasslands, and we'll find out more. But this edition of Minnesota Bound Podcast is brought to you by North Dakota Tourism and Star Banks, as well as the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And I'm thinking I've got one more I'm missing here. Oh, Connecticut. Who could forget Connecticut water? Connecticut, I have it in my home. And if you think you've got bad water, that is the solution. It has many, many advantages. I had iron in my water, and years ago I installed Connecticut. I have it right to the drinking area in the sink, and it's been amazing. Takes very little salt. It's high tech. Connecticut is the way to go. Now, if you're looking for wide open spaces to go pheasant hunting, North Dakota Tourism invites you to enjoy the great wide open spaces of North Dakota, and there's what I hear, great pheasant reports this year. Minnesota DNR, of course, a lot of us take what they do for granted, but we have wildlife management areas that they take care of, and they maintain hunter walking trails and plant food plots for wildlife, and constantly develop acres and acres of prairie and grasslands, which of course is our topic. To find out more about Minnesota wildlife management areas, go to mndnr.gov/WMAS wildlife management areas. And And don't forget Star Bank. We'll have a message from them as well.
Hi there, Ron Schara here for Star Bank. If you're putting your money into mega banks down the street, who knows where that money's being used? It's time to make the switch. Bank locally. Keep your money local with a community bank that actually cares about you, your family, your business, and your goals. Let me give you some advice from personal experience. Check out the bank we use at Minnesota Bound. Try Minnesota's own Star Bank. You can find them online at starbank.net. When you call Star Bank, you actually hear a real living person answering the phone. Star Bank has 10 convenient locations around Minnesota to serve you and all the mobile banking products that you need to manage your money. From Maple Lake to Elbow Lake, Eagle Bend to Eden Prairie. Check out all that Star Bank has to offer at starbank.net.
So, Greg, again, thank you for joining me. Greg is with the Department of Natural Resources. He's the DNR Wildlife Prairie Team Leader. That sounds like a pretty impressive title, Greg.
Yeah, well, it sounds impressive. Yes, I'll say that. Yes.
What made you? This might sound like a stupid question, and maybe it is. What prompted your interest in grasslands and the kind of research you've done to look into grasslands? I mean, most of us like, oh, there's grass, and it's grass. I mean, we're not talking about golf course grass. We're talking about grasslands, prairies, etc. What prompted your interest in that?
Yeah, there's no argument. Grasslands are the most kind of overlooked part of any habitat. There's no cascading waterfalls, and there's no majestic mountains or massive trees that you can hug. But yeah, during as an undergraduate college student, one of my professors took me to a native prairie site in Indiana, and it only took a couple of visits, and I don't know, for some weird irrational reason, I just fell in love with it. Moved out to Kansas for graduate school for 8 years, studied in the Flint Hills, and then I've had several different jobs here in Minnesota for about the last 20 years. And they've all kind of, in some way or shape or form, kind of revolved around grasslands. And yeah, now I'm to the point I have actually the word prairie in my job title.
That sounds good. Let me go back to something you said earlier, which also prompted me to have you as a guest. You mentioned that, there's a lot of angst over climate change, blaming the excessive carbon in the atmosphere. And you come along and say, grasslands are great at getting rid of some of this carbon, removing it from the air and burying it in the ground. And you say, I go, well, why don't we have more grassland then? How come other people aren't talking about grassland as one way to get us out of the climate change crisis? Can you answer that?
No, I can't, unfortunately. I've been scratching my head about that same question for years. One of the things that frustrates myself and kind of my friends is, people always talk about, planting a tree and reforestation as a good climate change strategy. And again, in areas that were historically forested and have forest soils, that's great. But planting, a forest out in southwestern Minnesota, that's probably not the best thing from a carbon strategy, and it's definitely not the best thing from a grassland wildlife strategy. So yeah, there've been a number of papers published in kind of the research literature, and shows, yeah, they're pretty good and effective. And once again, once they've got that carbon locked up, it stays locked up. But yeah, it just for some reason hasn't gotten quite the traction that some other strategies for climate change have.
You're kind of the lone voice in the forest, so to speak.
I'm one of the lone ones.
Well, let's get to the bottom line here, Greg. You and I could hold out hope that more and more of Minnesota will eventually become grassland. What kind of hope do you realistically have? what would we need to do as a society to turn this around?
There are a couple things, and I do think I'm hopeful. There are several things we can look at. So right now, Ron, as you kind of described earlier, the advocates for grassland conservation are Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited members, people who are members of the Nature Conservancy, things like that. But it's just, again, it's not on society's radar. The way we can do that is maybe we don't talk about pheasants. If I'm talking to Aaron Sandquist, I'm going to talk pheasants, and I'm going to talk pheasant habitat, and maybe talk about insects, which baby pheasants like to eat. If I'm talking to somebody else, and I can see fairly well, if I start talking pheasants, their eyes glaze over. So you just either change the conversation, or don't even start with pheasants. Talk about clean water. Talk about minimizing, I'm not going to say eliminating flooding, because the grasslands aren't going to capture that much water, but we can start to minimize or mitigate flooding, and things like that. Probably one of the best success stories out there, which is, unfortunately, we don't have more of these, is the Worthington Wells story, where the city of Worthington had a drinking water problem. And they didn't invest in a bunch of infrastructure, and they didn't sink a water well 10 miles deep. They planted grass. And if you've ever talked to Scott Rawl, he can tell the story much better than I can. But the way to help the town out, to protect their drinking water, to protect the industries in the city of Worthington, was to go plant grass. And now Worthington has become, in addition to its water is safe and protected, it's now become a destination pheasant hunting spot. So by solving one problem, they actually created multiple benefits. And I think that's one of the places we need to be thinking. The term is stacked benefits. So if I plant some grass over here, I'll get some pheasants. If I plant some grass over here, I'll get some pheasants. I'll clean up some water. I'll store some flood water. I'll recharge the groundwater, because that water that sits in the wetlands is eventually going to filter down. Now I've got a much wider story to a much larger audience, as opposed to grass equals pheasants. And I think if we can start telling that story, I think we're going to generate more interest and get more people focused on these habitats. And by the way, that's going to create more pheasants for those of us who are into that sort of thing.
Yeah, indeed. I've said before, I'm not trying to sound sexist here, but I always said that the Edina housewife, you said, well, hey, we need more grassland so we have more pheasants. She's thinking, oh, you just want more feathered targets to shoot. And but when we say we need more grasslands to clean up the water, they understand water and polluted water, that you need clean water. So that's an easier thing for all of us to understand. Well, Greg, I think we're about out of time here. I want to thank you for this time. We should pick up this topic again, because for folks to finally understand the value of grassland probably takes more than one podcast. But again, thank you for your time.
Yes, and thank you for the invitation today. I'll be happy to talk in the future.
Join us again next week when we revive another Minnesota Bound podcast. Don't know what the topic will be, but it will be interesting. I guarantee you that.